Okay, we are in Chapter 8 of The Rape of the Mind by Just A. and Merleau. This is the first video. Trial by Trial. For the Special Marine Corps Court of Inquiry in Washington that had to judge one of the cases of brainwashing, I was asked, as an expert witness, if I could explain why some of the American officers yield rather easily to mental pressure exerted by the enemy. It was in the days when congressional investigations in our country were in full swing. In all honesty, I had to answer that sometimes coercive suggestions underlying such investigations could exert conforming pressure on susceptible minds. People are conditioned by numerous psychological processes in our daily political atmosphere. Though we have been forewarned of what totalitarian techniques may do to the mind, there is reason to be alarmed by the possible disruption of values brought about by some of our own troubles. The totalitarian dictator succeeded in transforming his apparatus of justice into an instrument of threat and domination. Where once a balanced feeling of justice had been recognized as the noblest ideal of civilized man, this ideal was now scoffed at by cynics like Hitler and Goebbels, and called a synthetic emotion useful only to impress or appease people. Thus, in the hands of totalitarian inquisitors and judges, justice has become a farce, a piece of propaganda to soothe the people's conscience. Investigative power is misused to arouse prejudices and animosities in those bystanders who have become too confused to distinguish between right and wrong. The totalitarian has taught us that the courts and the judiciary can be used as tools of thought control. This is why we have to study how our own institutions intentionally or unobtrusively may be used to distort our concepts of democratic freedom. The downfall of justice. To a psychologist, perhaps the most interesting aspect of the Moscow purge trials between 1936 and 1938 was the deep sense of moral shock felt by people all over the world, whose trust in the judicial process was shaken to its foundations by these perversions of justice. Discussions about the trials always concerned themselves less with the question of guilt or innocence of the accused than with the horrifying travesty of justice the trials presented. Somewhere deep in the soul of men lies the conviction that a judge is, by definition, a righteous, impartial man, that an appeal to the courts is the road to truth, that the law stands above corruption, degradation, and perversion. Of course, we recognize that judges are human beings like ourselves, that they can make mistakes as the rest of us do, and we are even willing to accept temporary injustice because we believe that there will be eventual vindication and that the rule of law and justice will remain triumphant. The moment the judicial process becomes a farce, a show to intimidate the people, something in man's soul is profoundly affected. When justice is no longer blind, but has her eye on the main chance, we become frightened and alarmed. To whom shall a man turn if he cannot find justice in the courts? During the course of psychotherapy, one of my patients was called to jury duty. The experience disturbed him deeply, for apparently the prosecutor in this case was more interested in getting a conviction than in finding out the truth. Although the jury had the last word and by its verdict condemned the prosecutor's strategy, our juror was greatly upset. What happens, he asked me, in other cases? Suppose the jurors cannot see through the lawyer's sophisms. Suppose they are taken in by his constant suggestion and insistence. Indeed, any trial can be used as a weapon of intimidation. It can, in a subtle way, intimidate the jurors and witnesses, the entire public. In totalitaria, some higher courts exist only to carry out this function of intimidation. Their purpose is to prove to their own citizens and to the world at large that there is a punishing and threatening force controlling the government, and that this force can use the judiciary for its own purposes. An apparently objective official investigation may become a weapon of political control simply through the suggestions that inevitably accompany it. The man who is under investigation is almost automatically stigmatized and blamed because our suspicions are thrust on him. The very fact that he is under scrutiny makes him suspect. Thus, even the so-called democratic power to investigate may become the power to destroy. We must beware of this danger. Already the approving or disapproving way of interrogation changes man's thinking about facts. Any judicial action, whether legal or investigative, which receives widespread publicity, exerts some mental pressure on the entire public. It is not only the participants in the action who have a stake in its eventual outcome. The citizens as a whole may well become emotionally involved in the proceedings. Any official investigation can be either a mere show of power or an act of truth. A show of power by a totalitarian government or by an unscrupulous demagogue, it can have frightening consequences. The German Reichstag fire, the Moscow purge trials, and the court actions against our POWs in China are prime examples of legal action which served to consolidate the political power of ruthless men and had for their object confusion of a helpless citizenry. An additional intention was to shock the public opinion of the world. If we look at legal inquiry from the point of view of each of its participants, we will see even more clearly the dangers we must guard against. The demagogue as prosecutor and hypnotist. Recent happenings in our own country indicate clearly that the methods used to satisfy a quest for power show a universal pattern. The ancient magic masks used to frighten the people may have been replaced by an overconfident show of physical strength by a hero artificially shaped as an object of admiration and identification for infantile minds. But the loud noises of propaganda are still with us, magnified 1,000-fold by the radio and television, and serving to intimidate and hypnotize our less alert contemporaries. A worldwide audience watching and listening to the demagogue playing all his different roles, the righteous accuser, the martyred victim, the voice of conscience, is temporarily thrown into a semi-frightened, trance-like state of exhausted inattentiveness through the monotonous repetition of threats, accusations, and cliches. The demagogue, like the totalitarian dictator, knows well how to lay a mental spell on the people, how to create a kind of mass suggestion and mass hypnosis. There is no intrinsic difference between individual and mass hypnosis. In hypnosis, the most intensified form of suggestion, the individual becomes temporarily automatized both physically and mentally. Such a clinical state of utter mental submission can be brought about quite easily in children and in primitive people, but it can be created in civilized adults too. Some of the American POWs in Korean prison camps were reduced to precisely this condition. The more the individual feels himself to be part of the group, the more easily he can become the victim of mass suggestion. This is why primitive communities which have a high degree of social integration and identification are so sensitive to suggestions. Sorcerers and magicians can often keep an entire tribe under their spell. Most crowds are rather easy to influence and hypnotize because common longings and yearnings increase the suggestibility of each member of the group. Each person has a tendency to identify with the rest of the group and with the leader as well, and this makes it easy for the leader to hold the people in his group. As Hitler said in Mind.wmv, the leader can count on increasing submissiveness from the masses, and we'll stop it right there. This is chapter 8 that we're beginning in the rape of the mind, and I'll see you in the next video.